Hey everyone, this time on Tim Talks Audio, we check out a new plugin as we talk about clipping versus limiting. Today we're going to be checking out Black Salt Audio's brand new plugin, Clipper. Clipping when we're mixing doesn't necessarily mean clipping the output. It means chopping off just the top peaks of our source signal in a different way than limiters do. That's why we're going to kind of talk about both clipping versus limiting. And when we're talking about limiting, we're going to go with hard limiters on this one. There are soft limiters out there that go in and out of limiting more gradually, but to compare clipping and limiting, we're going to go with hard limiters. Limiting is an extreme form of compression, and it also has attack and release times. These times are very fast, but there are still attack and release times, where clipping is an instantaneous kind of action. We're going to go over different uses of clipping and limiting within our session, so let's dive into the DAW and check out Black Salt Audio's Clipper. Okay, so here we are, and here is Clipper, the brand new plugin from Black Salt Audio. It's really easy because there's 4 controls. Black Salt Audio makes very easy plugins that don't have a lot of controls on them, but the controls are powerful nonetheless. Let's start with the left, where we have our input control. You can drive the input into your clipper if you're just looking for a little extra gain from your tracks. Then on top is the actual threshold of the clipper, and you'll use this in conjunction with the meters underneath. As we see everything coming in from the left-hand side, this is the input meter. And then this vertical line here, which corresponds with our threshold, will show us where clipping will begin and the amount of transients or amount of peaks above that are getting clipped off and just kind of snapped. Like I said before, clipping is an instantaneous action that does not have attack or release times. It just chops off the top and that's what you get. Unlike limiting, which will see something approaching the threshold or going over the threshold, take the attack time into consideration, push it down, and then once it's underneath the threshold, the release will open things back up again. So they're doing very similar things, except how they do it and the sound of them are pretty different. Let's go to our drums real quick. This bus right here, and I'm actually just going to solo it out. Let me give you guys a bass line. First, I'm going to close out Clipper, and I'm going to turn off everything. So now we're just going to hear the raw drums. These are programmed drums using CornF Audio coded 19 drums. And there's no other processing. It's just going into this drum bus, and this drum bus is going to the mix bus where there's just a limiter over here, and honestly, it's not doing anything. Its ceiling is set to minus 0.2. It's just to make sure that I don't clip anything on the output. I do have some other stuff going on, but they're inactive right now. So here are our raw drums. Okay, so now let's start with clipping. I'm going to open up Black Salt Clipper and I'm going to activate it. So let's listen to our drums clip now. So first things first, I have gain matched both the raw and the clipped versions. Now I've already set the clip and the limited versions together already, so there's not going to be any volume difference. But for the raw drums and the clipper, there is some processing going on for you guys so that the raw drums and the clipped drums sound the same volume. And now we're just listening to what it's actually doing. So now let's talk about that. What is it doing? We are affecting the dynamic range because we're reducing the difference between the loudest peaks and some of the sustain and the lower parts of our source material, in this case drums. So we're just taking those peaks, and really I'm only affecting the snare drum and the kick drums, and really just the attack of the kick drums. When we watch Clipper, it's only reacting with those really fast transients and the loudest bits, kick, snare, and some of the cymbals. It's not getting our hi-hats or anything like that, but we're hearing it affect those hi-hats because we're reducing our dynamic range. We're clipping off the tops of our peaks. And we're doing this without any gain reduction. That's what a limiter would do. So now let's switch over. I'm going to turn off Clipper, or I'm going to put it into bypass. And I'm going to switch over to the Waves L1. Everybody knows this. It's classic. Everyone probably has this one too. So this is a good comparison for pretty much everybody. If not, you can use the stock limiter. That's totally fine. I'm actually just going to open up the channel editor because, like we've done in a previous video, I have this button here, which will allow me to A/B for you guys in a little bit between Black Salt Audio's Clipper and Waves L1. But let's just go with L1 for now. We're going to turn this guy on. And now listen to our drums through a limiter. So very similar kind of thing. We're only affecting the very top peaks, our snares, our kicks, and probably those crash cymbals. We're not touching anything else. We're not really affecting the sustain of any of the notes or the drum shells themselves. We're just kind of clipping off the transients, or in this case, we're limiting them. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to do our A/B test between clipping and limiting. On top, Black Salt Audio's Clipper, underneath Waves L1. This is the stereo version, and you can see here's our release. We were talking about this. It has attack and release times. With the L1, you can adjust this, or you can set it to auto. Watch when I hit the button here, and you can also look at the activator icons for BSA Clipper or L1. You'll know when I'm flipping back and forth. Also, you'll see L1 activating or Clipper doing its thing. But if you really need to watch where I'm clicking with bypass or check out the activate buttons over here. Now let's listen to our drums. What I want you to pay attention to are the transients of the drums. Listen to the initial impact. So for me, what I'm hearing is with clipping, we're not really losing some of that transient or any of the punch. All of that is there. We're just reducing the dynamic range and allowing the clipper to do a little bit of saturation. When you push into a clipper really hard, the saturation that you get from that can be very pleasing. It's more aggressive, but for some situations, that might be what you're going for. When I listen with the L1, I feel like I'm losing just a little bit of those transients and the initial impact and some of the punch of these drums. I am getting that reduction that we're looking for because that's what we're doing all of this for, but I feel like I'm sacrificing too much of the tone of my drums in order to get that kind of just leveling off. That, and when you push a limiter too hard, it will get into distortion, and limiter distortion isn't nearly as pleasing as clipper distortion. There are uses for both. Absolutely. You can do that with either one, but really you have to use the knowledge of when to use which. With clipping, it's a little bit more aggressive. With limiting, pushing into that distortion range is a little harder to do because of those attack and release times, and you can use that to adjust if your limiter has controls for the attack time. With L1, we just have release times. It's a fixed attack, but there's other limiters out there that do offer adjustments for your attack time. Before we move on to anything else, let's talk about distortion through a clipper versus distortion through a limiter and how they sound. I'm just going to drop the threshold of clipper because this will not affect the output volume. You're just going to hear the distortion and saturation that we get with a clipper, and then we're going to do the same thing with L1. So you can hear with L1, it's some distortion, obviously, but they are different. With using a clipper, it's more like the way that you would drive an analog console or drive into tape, and there's just no more room for that information to go. With a limiter, you're just squashing everything down and folding it in on itself. So they do have different characteristics within this distortion and saturation. Now, last thing we're going to talk about is using both clipping and limiting to make our tracks that much louder. Like I said before, I have a limiter on my mix bus right now just to catch any kind of peaks that might want to go over. And we don't want that to happen. But what we can do is we can throw a clipper on before our limiter, and that'll actually reduce our dynamic range before we hit the limiter. And it can give us some of the clipping saturation before we hit that as well. So it helps negate any of the limiting distortion and will actually give us some clipping distortion into the limiter, helping us bring our overall volume up. You can also flip the order and go from a limiter into a clipper, and that will really bring out any kind of peaks that may have gone through the limiter because they are subject to attack and release times. And the clipper will just kind of chop everything off. There's nothing getting past that, and it will still allow you to get some of that distortion. So let's throw BSA clipper in before our limiter. So I'm just going to throw it in on my mix bus and change the order real quick. So now I'm going to do a little bit of clipping on my mix bus. So immediately with the clipper before the limiter wasn't touching anything. And before, maybe it was giving me a 1/10 of a dB of reduction just to make sure nothing went over. Now I can actually drive the input to my limiter, get a little bit of reduction here, and increase the overall volume of my track. What happens if we reverse that order? I'm just going to drag my limiter before my clipper. And now let's take a listen. So now reversing the order, we're able to do a little bit of reduction on our limiter. And for anything that might be getting past, we're rounding it off with the BSA clipper. And this is still keeping us under 0 or digital clipping on the way out. And that's something we want to avoid. Inside our sessions, while we're mixing, clipping can be a really cool tool. And actually something you could probably explore a little bit more. I want to thank the guys over at Black Salt Audio for letting me get a chance of getting Clipper before its release, but it's available now. If you check the link in the description, you can pick up your copy of BSA Clipper and use it inside your sessions and get your tracks louder. That's all for now. If you found anything informative, please like and share the video. For booking information, check out timflansbaum.com. And if you have a question, ask it in the comments and I'll answer it in a future video. Thanks for watching.